The first exercise in lesson 3 has to do with drawing leaves. Now, this is a pretty common thing that comes up with this topic of drawing plants, but it's not that we're learning how to draw plants specifically, it's that we are trying to learn the concept of constructional drawing from this perspective of drawing plants. And as we move through the different lessons, it'll be more about changing the way we look at the same problem and attacking it from different angles and applying it to different subjects. But it's really all about learning the same topic, construction. And in this case, the construction of leaves is really about the construction of flat objects that exist and flow through 3D space. So we did tackle this a little bit with the arrows exercise in lesson 2. And we're essentially applying that concept to something more related to plants. This exercise has 3 different steps. First, we establish the flow of our leaf. Which basically means setting down a single line. And we want to do that from a starting point to an end point. We don't actually have to necessarily distinguish where those are, but we want to keep it in mind. That is a flow. You can think of it as though this object is flowing from this location here in an organic fashion and eventually reaches this other point. Our leaves are very directional. They definitely have that sense of moving from one point to another. So this really helps capture the core of what they are. Once you have their flow down, you've already essentially solved the problem. And construction itself is really about taking a complex problem, breaking it up into manageable chunks, handling them one at a time, answering one question at a time, solving one small problem at a time, and then once you move on to the next stage, you've already solved that problem. You don't need to resolve it. So you're essentially you're trying to just break it all down so that you can manage it instead of being overwhelmed by the entire larger problem at hand. So the second step is to enclose your leaf shape. Here we want to be just as simple. We do not want to get so caught up in all the complexities of the form we're creating. We really just want to draw 2 simple curves. So we've essentially taken what was once the flow of a line. A line is usually one-dimensional, and it's running through 3D space. And then we are enclosing a 2-dimensional shape around it. Lastly, we've got just other details. So these first 2 steps are obviously the most important and should be the focus of your approach. Some people will get really focused on, oh, I want to create something very pretty and detailed and have all these things going on, and then they lose track of the construction. They don't focus on it while they're working on those stages, and they lose track of the whole thing. But details are simple matters of like changing up your edge, not quality, but like adding a little bit of additional edge detail, like a wavy edge instead of something being completely straight and crisp. Maybe some little holes that have kind of worn into a dried leaf or something. Really don't spend too much time on this. It's not the point of the exercise. It's really just decoration. Although when it comes to varying your leaf's edges, there is an important thing to keep in mind there, and that's there's actually a few points. First of all, I don't want you to draw a single continuous wavy line, because each ripple, each kind of outcropping here, each bump is a separate element. It exists separately. So this is one, this is another, and while they have some vague relation to each other, they are not the same bump. So you don't want to define them using the same line. You want to bump them all up individually so that you can control and design how that happens. Design is an important word because it really conveys the intent that you are supposed to have, whereas when you're drawing a single continuous wave, you lose a sense of conscious intent and you end up just following the pattern of your line. You do not want your, just like you don't want your brain to do the drawing, you don't want your hand to do the thinking. Another issue is that people will, well, actually this, if you're following the first point, it pretty much avoids the second, but I want you to keep on top of, keep using this edge, this simple edge here. This is one of the problems that you've already solved. I don't want you to draw as though you're ignoring it or using it as a vague, idea of what you're trying to follow. You've essentially established a piece of your scaffolding and you need to adhere to it. Notice how I'm drawing from this edge up into a bump and then back into the edge. I want to keep sticking to this thing. So even if I was dipping below, I'd still come back to match the exact same one. So you can go up from that edge, you can go down from that edge, but you always return to the same edge. Another issue that tends to come up pretty often is when you start drawing, you look at your piece of paper like it's just a flat page. And yes, technically that is exactly what it is. But what you should really get into the habit of kind of convincing yourself of is that you're in fact looking at a window. It is a window into a large, infinite, three-dimensional space. And the lines that you are drawing are not simply lines that carve across a flat piece of paper. They are lines that move through all three dimensions of space. So when you are thinking about, well, I want to curve from this point to this point, it's not just moving across two dimensions. There is depth there. One of these points is farther away from the viewer, and another point is closer. Now, while this won't exactly manifest in the drawing that you're doing right now, the way that you, the actual mark that you're making, it's not like we're saying, well, perspective now comes into play. It's still just going to be a simple curve. It exists in literal terms. It is still just a two-dimensional line. But the more important point here is that you need to convince yourself that you are in fact drawing in 3D space. You need to believe in the lie that you are selling to others. Because if you don't convince yourself of it, you won't be convincing anyone else. And this will come up very frequently, that you need to believe in the solidity of the forms that you're creating, that you need to believe that they actually sit in three-dimensional space. You need to be convinced. And it's very easy to say, but it takes time to really buy into this massive lie. So when you're drawing one of your leaves, think about the fact that one point is, here, let's do this actually. One point is farther away. So this obviously doesn't convey that at all, and it's not really supposed to because it's just a simple curve. But I believe that this end is farther away and that this end is closer. So when I enclose my shape, I'm still thinking about that. Still thinking about the fact that they're compressed lines, and maybe they're spreading out more as they come out. In my mind, I'm still thinking about perspective. So it was just like when you were thinking about the arrows in lesson 2. I brought this up then as well, that this end ends up being bigger and this end ends up being smaller. It comes out that way, not because I'm consciously necessarily thinking about it all the time, it's because I already believe it. I don't think about the fact that this end needs to be bigger. and this needs to be smaller, I think about the fact that this end is closer to me and this end is farther away. So just try and keep in mind, it's all 3D. You are not drawing on a 2D piece of paper. It's a window. There's a lot more out there to be seen, even beyond the edges of your page. I believe, oh wait, no, there's actually one more point that I want to bring up. When you have a curve, you may feel the need to enclose it without overlapping. You may feel worried that, well, it's not going to come out right if I let my curves overlap. Don't be afraid to let your lines overlap. Here you can see that I tried very, very hard to keep it on one side. Whereas had I done this, initially it looks confusing and strange. I should have closed that off. But you can actually think of it as though these are essentially 3 different edges flowing through space, and you can bridge across them. You've got your spine here in the middle, and it kind of fans out. It does not necessarily go in one direction. Because it's flowing through 3D space, let's try here. You can have all kinds of twists and bends, and you don't need to feel like you're adhering strictly to them staying on one side of the shape. If you were just drawing 2-dimensional shapes, then yeah, you wouldn't really have a way to handle overlaps and twists. But since it's a 3D form, you absolutely can, and you should explore more twists and turns. You just have to kind of keep in mind which side is which. So I know that this side here is the closest edge to the viewer, and it's overlapping this twist back here. So just try and play a little bit more with, be flexible. Try not to get caught up in being too rigid. Take risks, experiment with things, and just see how they turn out. And as always, don't be afraid to fail, because you're bound to make hundreds and thousands of mistakes across all of this stuff. There's no point in trying to avoid it. It's better that you be bold first and then reel yourself back later than trying to kind of work up to a sort of boldness, because that's not really how boldness works. Anyway, that kind of covers the major points that I wanted to mention. I'll just kind of recap. You have 3 steps for leaf construction, 2 of which are the most important. You have your flow that you're establishing, and enclose a shape for your leaf, and then there's just the extra detail. And then in terms of pitfalls, you've got think 3D, respect your construction. Once you have a previous stage of construction in place, don't ignore it. Don't try and fly off the handle from it. You've already solved that problem. You don't want to be trying to resolve it later on. That's a waste of time. It's inefficient. It's ineffective. And you're going to end up losing the illusion of solidity. And don't be afraid to twist and overlap. And be bold. Take risks. And that's basically it. So I'll leave this video off here.